Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. So he sought how he might conveniently betray him.
All of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee.
Even if all are made to stumble, yet I will not be.
Assuredly, I say to you that today, even this night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times.
But he spoke more vehemently.
If I have to die with you, I will not deny you.
And they all said likewise. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a signal.
Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely.
As soon as he had come, immediately he went up to him.
Rabbi, Rabbi,
and kissed him. Then they laid their hands on him and took him. And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus answered and said to them,
Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled.
Then they all forsook him and fled. Now, a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. But Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Now as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said,
You also were with Jesus of Nazareth.
I neither know nor understand what you are saying.
And he went out on the porch, and a rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him again, and began to say to those who stood by,
This is one of them.
But he denied it again. And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter again,
Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean and your speech shows it.
Then he began to curse and swear.
I do not know this man of whom you speak.
A second time, the rooster crowed. Then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him.
Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times.
And when he thought about it, he wept.
I've entitled this morning's talk, Acting Under Pressure. I don't know about you, but I find it really easy to keep a cool head when things are relatively easy. Like if I don't get out of bed during the day, I find it really easy to love people. But then if I come in contact with them, that might be another story. And I'm going to be a little bit more transparent this morning, because often we look at preachers and we have them way up here and ourselves way down there, when it's more like this. And so let me give you an example. My wife, I mean, she has got the patience of a saint with me. And so Marie and my kids have actually banned me from the strimmer. You know, the whippersnipper, the strimmer? I was telling a mate of mine from Portland, Daryl, actually Mary Ann's husband who's here this morning, I was telling Daryl, I ran into him at Bunnings the other week, here in Hamilton, by the way, and of all places to meet your parishioners. Anyway, and he said, what are you doing? We got talking, and I explained to him, I said, listen, my wife and my kids have banned me from the whippersnipper. He goes, really? Why is that? I said, have you ever watched those Marvel movies? There's a character there called the Incredible Hulk. He's a normal-looking guy, but then he just gets this rage of anger and he turns green. I said, that's me. I said, there is something about a whippersnipper that just brings out the worst in me. There are other things, you know, where I have patience, but there's just something about a whippersnipper that all of a sudden you'll see a different person than you are seeing here this morning. You know, it's easy to keep a cool head when things are relatively easy. But when things are going bad or awry for us, all of a sudden, when the pressure's on, a different person can come out and we think, my goodness, I thought I'd crucified that person 20, 30 years ago, and yet they're still there. It's also it's also easy to be loyal to someone or a company or a church when things are going smoothly. And yet in a church, the moment that you start to get a few people bickering, all of a sudden loyalties are divided. Or think of a sports person for a moment. I mean, we're in the southern hemisphere, aren't we? And so in New Zealand, in Australia, think of sports people. You know, that they are loyal. There is no way that I'm moving. And then 2 weeks later, we find out just because somebody in Europe has offered them twice as amount, or twice as much money, all of a sudden their loyalty just goes out the window. When things don't go our way, or things heat up, or things don't tend to happen the way that we envisioned that they would go, we react differently. How do you react when things in your life don't turn out the way that you thought that they would, or the way that you thought God would pan those things out? When the pressure is on and things don't go according to our plan, that's really where we discover who we truly are. And it's a humbling thing for me to say that here this morning. And often when we are under pressure, I know none of you would do this, but you probably know somebody who's done this. I'm joking, by the way. But when we are under pressure, we often will say or do things that we later just regret. And I'm pretty confident that all of us have experienced a failure to respond in a consistent Christian manner. You know, often we might do the things that the scriptures say, to love people, to forgive them, to show them grace. But there'll be that one time when just that one person just seems to just get underneath our skin. All of us, no doubt, have said things that we wish that we could take back. Pressure has a way of getting to us where we say things and we do things that we regret. And so pressure is our nemesis. And chapter 14, I know we didn't read all of it, and I kind of just scaled it back this morning because I didn't want us to be here for 15 minutes reading one chapter. I thought you might have went to sleep. But I do encourage you, if you haven't read it, to go back and read Mark chapter 14. And if you haven't read even the Gospel of Mark, to go and read the Gospel of Mark. But at least today, go back and read Mark chapter 14. But Mark chapter 14 is all about pressure. The pressure is mounting on Jesus. You know, the heat, you know, is just, things are all heating up. And the pressure isn't just mounting on him. The pressure is mounting on those who are around him. And so the Passion story, or the Easter story, whatever you want to call it, is pretty much a story of how we deal with pressure and where our loyalties lay. Pressure tests our loyalties. It's interesting to study all of the characters in this story, particularly as we get to the last week of Jesus. We didn't read it this morning. I noticed and I thought, oh, that's pretty good, but I'm about to mention it. You'll notice in chapter 14, there's a guy who runs off naked under the pressure. You know, and we also read about Judas who betrayed Jesus. There is Peter who denied him. There is Caiaphas, the religious leader. There is Pilate, who was caught between two loyalties. Will he release a madman or a guilty man by the name of Barabbas, or will he release an innocent man by the name of Jesus? And of course, there's the soldiers, there's a centurion. There are those who are at the feet of Jesus as he's on the cross. And of course, there is Joseph of Arimathea. And then, of course, there is Jesus himself. And each of these characters draws us into the story in which we are forced to ask the question, if I was there, how would I have reacted? Would I have ran off naked? Hopefully not. Would I have denied Jesus? Would I have betrayed him? Would I have been like Jesus, where I would have remained loyal to God even to the point of death? How would I have reacted under such extreme pressure? How we react under pressure is important. And so today what I want to do is just briefly look at two characters who were under pressure, as Jeff mentioned before, Judas and Peter. And as we look at them, I want you to ask this question: what would you do in the face of fear? So let's firstly look at Judas. Judas is an interesting person to study. What we see in Judas, we can also see in ourselves. We see in him that there are attitudes of selfishness. And we can all act selfishly. Well, maybe not you, but you might know somebody who acts selfishly. We can be greedy, more money, lust for power. We can also be confused, be depressed, and we can also betray others. We might not act all of those things out at once, but we can see a reflection of ourselves in Judas's mirror. Look at the situation. Judas was one of Jesus' disciples, wasn't he? Jesus actually chose Judas, if you read the Gospels. So he was one of the disciples, but he was the only disciple that was not a Galilean. All the other disciples come from the north, out of the 12, but Judas actually came from the south. And he was a member of a nationalistic Jewish sect dedicated to overthrowing the Roman rule. And this is important that we understand the historical context here. And so Jesus elected him as treasurer. And it might sound quite controversial to say this morning, but I am absolutely convinced that Judas loved Jesus in his own little way, in the way that you and I would love Jesus. There is no doubt in my mind that Judas wanted Jesus to be the Messiah. But of course, his view of the Messiah is very different to Jesus' view of the Messiah. Judas saw the Messiah as a national hero. He saw him as what we would call a zealot, one who would overthrow the Roman rule and restore Israel to her state of independence. But not only that, he saw him as a king. And to be one of the king's followers would mean that if they overthrow the Roman rule, then of course the enemies would then serve them. And so this was Judas's view of the Messiah. He saw the Messiah, you could pretty much say, as a political Messiah. And yet, how did Jesus see himself as the Messiah? How did Jesus speak of himself this morning in our text? And this is the third time this morning in a short couple of chapters that Jesus has spoken of himself in such ways. He says the Messiah will lay down his life. He will die for the sins of humanity. And 3 days later, he will rise from the dead. I'm sure that this was confusing for Judas as it was for the rest of the disciples. How could the Messiah deliver Israel from her enemies if the Messiah was going to die? And so this was not the talk that Judas wanted to hear. Judas obviously believed Jesus to be the Messiah, but now the Messiah, Jesus, is not performing according to Judas's expectations. And just think about this for a moment. What happens when you and I do not perform according to people's expectations? Well, I know in my case that when I don't perform according to people's expectations, all of a sudden they try to manipulate the situation. They try to manipulate me. And then, of course, after they've tried to manipulate it, they just kind of wipe their hands clean of you. They turn their backs on you. Judas took matters into his own hands by betraying Jesus. Now, generally, it's taught that Judas betrayed Jesus because he wanted to get rich. That is partially true, but I don't think it's fully true, and I'll tell you why in a minute. I wonder if there's something deeper going on here with Judas that we just haven't quite picked up, because often we'll read the Bible on a surface level and we won't dig deep enough, or we won't wrestle with the text enough to go a little bit deeper. But I wonder if Judas thought, and this is just my thoughts here, you can take it and you can leave it, or you can discuss it amongst yourselves if you want. You don't have to agree with me, okay? I'll still love you if you don't agree with me. But I wonder if he thought that if he could force a confrontation between Jesus in Rome, because by forcing this confrontation, it would actually force Jesus to pick up the sword, take up political arms. So perhaps Judas here is trying to manipulate the situation. He's trying to force the situation. It's a plausible theory that I just raised, because if it was just about Judas getting rich, why does he hand the money back? In any case, Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, as was prophesied in the Old Testament. And of course, we read this morning that he betrayed Jesus with a kiss, and the soldiers took Jesus away. And when Judas saw this, he tried to give the money back. And I'm no psychologist here. I don't pretend to be a psychologist, but it would appear as we read on in the story, at this point, regret, remorse, and depression set in. It could be just my pastoral heart, because we know there's a difference between teachers who tend to just be all about knowledge. And I'm not saying they don't love people, but they tend to care more about truth, whereas pastors tend to care more about people. And there's both positives and negatives. So it could be my pastoral heart here, but I've always felt for Judas, because he could be any zealous person that is here this morning, myself included. You know, that could have easily been me who condemned Jesus, because often I can be very zealous for God. And when things don't happen the way that I want to see them happen, I can easily manipulate the situation. The only difference between now and 20 years ago is I'm aware of it. I wasn't aware of it back then. There's a lesson here that I want to just extrapolate for us, and that we must be very careful when we grow impatient. When things don't go the way that we wanted them to go, or the way that we imagined or hoped or believed that God, would make the way go, that we don't take matters into our own hands. Now, next we see Peter. And while it's possible for us to overlook ourselves in Judas, it's almost impossible not to see ourselves in Peter. Well, at least I'll put my hand up and just say, when I look at Peter, I think of myself as a younger bloke. Peter was impulsive. The moment he just saw things, he just lived for the moment. He would just do them. He was quick-spoken. He suffered from foot-mouth disease. Do you know what foot-mouth disease is? And I'm talking to farmers here. I'm not talking about your cattle, okay? It's that part where you don't engage your brain before you speak, and you often say things that you later regret. And hopefully, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and maturity happens quicker for some, but for people like me, it's a slow process. And hopefully, as you mature in life, the more mistakes you make, you learn not to say so many daft and crazy things. You learn to engage your head before you actually say it. And this was Peter. But Peter was also full of emotion. He would be, as we would say in Australia, he wore his heart on his sleeve. He would die on his knees for Jesus. But he was also weak. It was like two sides of a coin to his personality. He had strengths, but he also had weaknesses. And like a lot of Christians, Peter actually thought that he was a lot better than he actually was. He thought that he was strong. He thought that he was a courageous leader. He thought that he was loyal. In actual fact, his pride led him to think that he was a lot better than the other disciples. We read about that this morning, because when Jesus said that they would all depart from him, Peter replied, "Even if they may all fall away, I will not." I'm the chief disciple here. Where they're weak, I'm strong. And when Peter said it, I'm convinced that he meant that with all of his heart at that moment in time. And we've all made promises. Well, should just presume, but I know I've made promises that later on I haven't kept. Like so many of us, Peter misjudged himself, thinking too highly of himself. And we can easily do that. In my younger years, I don't know if you've ever done this, but people used to worship missionaries. And Africa was just the place that everybody seemed to want to go. And I can remember on Sunday saying, God, I will go wherever you send me. I will do whatever you call me to do, only to break it come Monday. And we can often make promises on Sunday that we break Monday. Peter loved Jesus. Peter was willing to lay down his life for Jesus. I truly believe he meant that. Why do I say that? Because when the guards came up, that servant came up, what did Peter do? He picked up his sword, he chops the guy's ear off. And so there is no doubt in my mind, at that moment in time, Peter was ready to die for Jesus. He was fully committed. He was completely in. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what happened between that moment when he picked up his sword and the moment that he denied Jesus? Well, yet again, this is open to debate. So you are free to disagree with me on this. These are just my thoughts here. But I'm going to suggest to you this morning that Jesus' next actions through Peter and perhaps caused Peter to question Jesus and actually the mission of the Messiah. Because when Peter cut the servant's ear off, what did Jesus do? He healed the man. And he told Peter to what? To put down his weapon. I think Peter got confused here because Peter's probably thinking, wait a minute, I was willing to take up my sword. I was willing to defend you. And yet the moment I pick up my weapon, you tell me to lay my weapon down. And rather than you, Jesus, pick up your sword and defeat the enemy, you heal the enemy. Peter would have been confused. Wait a minute. If Jesus wasn't asking me to die for him, what was he asking me to do then? You know, it's often been said that it's easier to die for someone than it is to live for someone. Dying for Jesus would not appear to be Peter's problem. And so that only leaves one other thing, living for Jesus. If Jesus wasn't asking Peter to die for him, he must have been asking him to live for him. And this would appear to be a lot tougher for Peter to do. Dying for Jesus was easy. Living for Jesus would prove to be a lot harder, especially through times of persecution and tribulation and trials. And even though Peter claimed that he would never fall away, Jesus told him before the rooster crowed how many times? Twice. He would deny him 3 times. And that's exactly what we hear. You know, as Christians, we often talk about how the enemy knows our weakness and he strikes in those areas where we struggle. You know, if sexually we are weak, we'll be tempted in the area of sexuality. If we have a lust for wealth, then we'll be tempted in the area of gambling and fraud. Or if we are easily depressed, then we will be tempted to turn to a life of alcohol and things like that. But you know, it's not just the enemy. God knows our strengths. God knows our weaknesses. And I'm not saying that God causes these things. And God does not tempt us. But he does allow situations to arise to expose our weaknesses. And exposing our weaknesses, we have 2 options. Number 1, we can remain stubborn and closed-minded to God. Or number 2, we can allow our weaknesses to humble us that in order that it will guide us to God for strength and salvation. All in all, this story exposes Peter's weakness. When the servant girl and the others query Peter and his loyalty to Jesus, Peter denied Jesus. In many ways, Peter was both strong and weak, just like us. And in the face of fear, Peter was found to be weak and he denied Jesus before the world. Now, when Peter realized what he did, he, like Judas, was also remorseful. He was full of regret. He struggled with his failure. Yet despite his failure, Jesus chose to love and forgive Peter. And that is why, as we read at the end of Mark's Gospel in chapter 16 and verse 7, after Jesus has been crucified and then he is risen from the dead, the women come to the empty tomb and they meet a messenger there. And the messenger tells them that Jesus is no longer there. And in actual fact, he's went to Galilee ahead of them. And they are to gather the disciples and make their way to Galilee. But you know, the servant says something really unique. He adds these personal words. He says, go and tell the disciples and tell Peter also. Just like us, Jesus knew that Peter's guilt and his shame for his failures would hinder him from entering into his presence. And therefore, Jesus sought out Peter. There is something beautiful about the way that Jesus deals with Peter's failure, and he restores him back into the community of God. And there is something beautiful about the way that God deals with our failure and restores us back into his fellowship when we have failed him. You know, we have all failed God, and despite our failure, God time and time again invites us to share in his life. And in so doing, he forgives all people who receive him. And maybe you are here this morning, you are looking over your life. There are things that you have said, there are things that you have done that have filled you with regret, remorse. You wish that you could go back to those moments, and you wish that you could just say something different or do something different. You know, as I'm speaking this morning, I'm actually thinking of something in my own past where I wish I had have acted differently towards my sister. I wish I actually had have said something that brought life and healing and meaning rather than a word that just killed and destroyed. And maybe you're here and you have deep regret. Maybe you falsely think that this will hinder you from entering into God's presence. God could never love you, nor could he accept you. But the good news is our God is a compassionate God. Our God is a loving God. Our God is a forgiving God. And God wants you to come to him through Jesus. He wants you to give him all your years of sadness, all your tears, all your failures, all your regrets, so that you can freely share in his life, his freedom, his love, his acceptance, his eternal life. In closing, what we see in today's story is when the pressure was on, both Judas and Peter failed Jesus in their own way, but they handled it differently. Judas got depressed and he condemned himself, whereas Peter threw himself at the Lord's mercy. And the question that I want to leave you with this morning is this: what do you do with your failure regarding God? Does your failure drive you away from God to depression, alcohol, drugs, gambling, a life of despair? Or does your failure drive you to the loving mercies of God?